Hello, and welcome to, thank you for all for joining us today. I'm Phyllis Jordan. I'm Associate Director of Future Ed, which is a think tank at Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy. And I'm author of much of what Future Ed has written about attendance, including recently an update of the attendance playbook with Attendance Works. You know, it's become really clear in the past few months that attendance has risen dramatically, and that left unchecked, these missed days are going to undermine our efforts to help students recover academically and socially from the pandemic. While much of the conversation is focused on what educators can do on the ground, legislators and state policymakers have really stepped up and started to enact have for years been enacting some broad efforts, broad policy steps that can bring kids back to school regularly. Not all of these are constructive. Just today, I read that the Missouri Supreme Court upheld a bill that will allow communities to put parents in jail if their students don't attend school regularly, without any definition of what regular is. But at least 18 other states that I've found in my research have adopted more holistic approaches that involve things like defining chronic absenteeism, or requiring tracking of and reporting of data, or encouraging evidence-based practices and dialing back the punitive approaches to truancy. The speakers on our webinar today can describe their legislative efforts in their own states and the trends that we're seeing emerging. We will take questions at the end of our conversation. So if you have questions, you've got a Q&A tab. You can put the questions in there. There is a chat tab. We're not having people on the chat. We will be putting some resources there, though. Let me give a quick introduction to everyone who's on our panel today, and then I'll start in with some questions. Hedy Chang is Executive Director of Attendance Works. It's a nonprofit dedicated to helping states and school districts find ways to reduce chronic absenteeism. Dan Johnson is a former principal and school administrator who now serves as a representative in the Utah legislature. He sponsored a successful bill this year. Gwen Warniment, she was Deputy Secretary in New Mexico's Public Education Department before becoming Executive Director of the state's bipartisan bicameral Legislative Education Study Committee. And one of the things she's studying is the impact of a 2019 bill on absenteeism. And Cynthia C is a senior policy analyst at the Advocates for Children of New Jersey, and where she analyzed attendance data and advocated successfully for state legislation. So I'm going to start with Hedy. You've researched and written about chronic absenteeism for the past 15 years. What do you think are the key policy steps that states should take to support schools and districts in reducing absenteeism? And what do you know about how states are doing and implementing these sorts of approaches?
Well, thank you, first of all, Phyllis, for inviting me, and for Future Ed for hosting this really important webinar, because legislation and the role of states is so key to this work. You know, while ESSA as a national policy encourages us to collect, or requires us to collect, chronic absence data, it's really been up to states whether they want to include this in accountability. And it's really up to states about whether they are ensuring that data is collected in a way that is comparable, accurate, easy to understand. And there's so much that is left to states to do and ensure that effective practices go to scale. I'm going to frame what states can do in terms of our key ingredients for systemic change. And if your team could post that up, that would be great. So the first ingredient, and if people can then take a quick look if you want a visual, but is really looking at actionable data. We need actionable data so that we can see as soon as possible when kids are chronically absent, when schools, when districts, when large populations of students, maybe particular grades of students are affected by chronic absence, so that we can take preventive and early intervention in order to improve chronic absence before kids have missed out on so much time that they are not able to succeed so well in school. And what we know, though, is that states are really responsible for that actionable data? Do you even define a day of attendance so that if you're looking at data from District A and District B, you're comparing the same thing? Is it available publicly so that everyone can take a look at it? Is it disaggregated? One example of a way that states haven't been disaggregating data is making it available by grade. And we actually know that chronic absence isn't the same across grades. I'm seeing in states that are disaggregating data incredibly high levels in kindergarten and then the high school years, and that allows you to take action. So actionable data, positive engagement, as you said, punitive approaches that just blame kids and don't help us understand why kids are missing school actually don't work so well. And positive engagement, relationship building, engaging in caring outreach does. So states can help encourage districts and schools to take that positive, engaging approach. Strategic partnerships, because chronic absence is beyond the control of just educators to address, especially given the kinds of barriers that students and families are facing. So how do we bring together those strategic partnerships, community agencies, public agencies, whether that's around transportation, access to healthcare, other resources, and then adequate and equitable resources, using data on chronic absence and poverty and other factors to determine who might need greater investments to achieve equitable outcomes. And then there's shared accountability, which is making sure, first of all, that we don't see this as finger pointing. I'm not going to blame anyone for why this exists, but I'm going to engage in collective problem solving and support, and how states then, this is the last the last criteria or key ingredient is build capacity, make sure that we take this collective non-blaming approach to engage in problem solving and really help schools, districts, communities work together to put in place tiered approaches that begin with prevention and early intervention. And if you look at our just a couple resources from us, our policy report, Monitoring Data Matters Even More, you can see how well states are beginning to put in place that actionable data. And there's also a state self-assessment that we have that allows folks to, as a state, take stock of where they are, where their strengths, where their challenges. And then we also have recommendations at the policy level on our website that folks can use if they want to think about what are the kinds of steps they can take.
Thanks, Hedy. I love your emphasis on actionable data, because there's always so much data states are swimming in, districts are swimming in, and to give it to them in a way that's useful, that they can actually make a difference for kids is really important.
And Phyllis, can I just say one thing, since
Sure.
you and I have been at this work a long time. When we first started this work in a decade ago, there was one state with chronic absence data on its published. That was Maryland. We now have, while it could be improved, 48 states plus Washington, D.C. published data on chronic absence. So there's much more to do, but I also want to acknowledge we've come a long way in the last decade.
That's a really good point. Representative Johnson, you recently pushed through a bill that requires districts to use evidence-based practices to reduce chronic absenteeism. Can you tell us a little bit about the bill and what inspired you to push for this legislation?
Well, first of all, I would just like to speak a bit to what Hedy just talked about, because that approach that she was visiting with us about is exactly what we've been doing in Utah, and is to try to take a look at that early intervention and and start engaging with parents right away. I think parental engagement is going to be the key to the answer to this problem long term. So I spent 50 years as a teacher, coach, 42 years then after those 8 years as a principal and associate superintendent. And so I was very interested in this topic just because of my background. And I realized that just watching and hearing what people were saying, during the pandemic and then post-pandemic, there were just lots and lots of kids that were missing school. So I was really concerned about that. So I started working with our State Office of Education with this issue. So our state superintendent is a great educator, Dr. Dixon. And then I worked with the associate superintendent, Patty Norman, and then her staff on crafting what this bill would be like and what we were going to attempt to do with it. But in addition to that, I reached out to juvenile justice because we're all aware of the school to prison pipeline. And that's a huge problem when you start making the connectivity between non-attendance at school, a lack of education, and then some of the problems that some individuals struggle a little later in life with. So we work very closely with juvenile justice along with our public education system, which included charter schools. So I just wanted to mention those people's names because this wasn't something I did by myself. It was such a wide and very collaborative effort. We put together a large work group across the state that worked on this problem for quite a while. And I think with what Hedy said, I would just let you know that in HB 400, you can look that up and get a copy of the bill. If there's information in there that you want to use in your state, that would be great. But its approach is a targeted positive promotion of attendance with non-punitive interventions. When I worked on this, the last thing I wanted to do was criminalize moms and dads or criminalize kids, but still hold them accountable. And I think that you can invite them in an engaging way and get them re-entered back into school without that. That doesn't mean that there aren't certain other consequences. That's still in law in Utah, but the emphasis is not going to be on that. It's going to be on other sorts of early interventions, and that's what this bill did. So part of the bill also provided funding for attendance specialists at the Utah State Office of Education. Now we tracked it, but we didn't have people who necessarily had the power that they needed to have and the resources that they needed to have in order to track this, in a way that needed to be done. So that was a really important outcome. In addition to that, there were juvenile justice in the youth system specialists that also could be hired out of the bill. So that was really important. And then the other thing that it did is it modernized the State Board of Education rules related to attendance. So that was why I worked closely with our group on that part. And so I would just let you know, we're really at the beginning stages of the implementation. And maybe later I could share with you some really important information because the state office has already done some comparative data on non-attendance at school and student academic performance.
Oh, interesting. I'd love to see that. Yeah, and your point about bringing in the juvenile justice system is so important because this is not just an education issue. Gwen, New Mexico approved a bill in 2019 that requires districts to track the data and develop strategies for dealing with it. Of course, since then, you've had a little bit of a pandemic and like everybody else, an increase in chronic absenteeism. You're now looking at how implementation is working. What are the challenges you've seen in addition to and beyond the pandemic?
Sure. Well, like Hedy and Dan, first I'm going to thank you, Phyllis and Bella, for hosting this very critical discussion for all of us. I'm going to just do a quick synthesis again of the bill because I think it's important in terms of the challenges that we're facing. So as you said, the bill did really three fundamental things. The first was redefined attendance for the state of New Mexico, moving away from sort of this truancy punitive model to defining chronic absenteeism, sort of to what Hedy was alluding to earlier in terms of really explicit definitions. The second thing that the bill did was asked for some pretty explicit plans on the part of school districts and schools so that they would establish these plans based on tiered interventions for students. And then the third was asking for better data and mechanisms for collecting and demonstrating, showing data to the community at large. And I recognize the legislator at the time where this law came from. His name was Perea, and interestingly enough, he was a school resource officer in his real job, actually. So our legislators, many of them have other jobs, professions, and so he really understood, and the impetus of the law was based off of his understanding that what would impact students was relationships with adults. So your question in terms of challenges is sort of related to those fundamental pieces of the law as a result of the pandemic. Obviously, once New Mexico went into remote instruction, our attendance policies were sort of up in the air and questionable and forgiving. And so the implementation of this law was difficult at best. And then in addition to that, there's a pretty distinct rural nature of New Mexico that's not just rural, I think, in terms of other states. There's states that are similar to ours, but they're rural and remote. And you had the opportunity to see that when you came to Taos, but there's remote in the fact that students drive sometimes 2 hours at a time on the bus to go to school and then back home, right? And so if you miss the bus, that's significant in terms of the impact on attendance and the ways in which implementation of this law and the tiered interventions actually can and should be happening. We've seen some challenges in making sure schools are able to form strong attendance teams. That's sort of called for and suggested in terms of these tiered interventions. In some cases, we see really strong and robust attendance teams. In others, it's just a principal that's leading attendance work. And I think I had a quick discussion with you as well in terms of when it's not clear who's in charge of attendance, it's sort of everyone's job. There's a default in terms of it's no one's job. And so there's this unclear recognition of attendance as a significant component of school and schooling and work. I think there's the intent of the law was established to create a more supportive structure, and that's a beautiful, wonderful thing, and establish these data collection requirements. But what we've learned, I think, is that schools, particularly in rural locations, need better explicit connections to what those actual resources are and what is available to them. So while the law has this great intent, it's easier to see implementation happen in, say, Albuquerque than it is in Central Consolidated or community that may not have the breadth of resources available for those students and for those schools and communities and families.
Great. Yeah. I mean, that whole rural aspect to attendance is something we don't always think about, but just the distances kids have to travel and the challenges there are really unique. Cynthia, as an advocate, you helped spur New Jersey lawmakers to approve legislation in 2018. What sort of strategies did you use to expose the problem and to encourage them to do something about it?
Sure. Well, first, thank you, Phyllis, for inviting me to tell the New Jersey story, which I think is a really interesting and good story about how chronic absenteeism really came to the forefront of both things going on in districts and in policy development. So I have to say in the forefront that when ACNJ, Advocates for Children in New Jersey, our state's largest multi-issue child advocacy organization, got involved with chronic absenteeism, it wasn't even on our radar. We tended to do more in education for the early years, so preschool through third grade, and we weren't really focusing. And it took an assistant commissioner of the Department of Education, who we had a very good working relationship, to say to us, you know what, have you looked at the chronic absenteeism numbers? And we said we hadn't, and she sent them over, and we were really very surprised at the numbers. We were fortunate enough to be able to look at them in various ways, by grade, as Hedy mentioned before, by demographics. And what we saw, we weren't really happy about. And so we decided that the first thing we needed to do was educate ourselves, and then we needed to educate others. And so we decided to put together a report, because we saw the first year we looked at it was 2013-14 school year. We saw about 125,000 K-12 students in New Jersey, about 10% of our population, student population, that were identified as chronically absent. And so we started again looking at the data by grade, by racial and family, social, economic. We looked at the early years, and we looked at the high school years, where that U shape of chronic absenteeism, the high numbers on both ends. And we also looked at those districts that had 10% or more of their students that were specifically chronically absent. And that was 177 districts, which represented about 30% of the total number of students in our state. So we worked collaboratively with the Department of Education, and we decided to publish the names of those 177 districts because we wanted to bring attention to the issue. At no point did we want to shame the districts, but we thought, it's human nature to say, that number's really bad, but it's not my district, because too many districts were looking at attendance rates and feeling good about themselves and not really looking at chronic absenteeism. And so a month before the report came out, all 177 district superintendents received a letter saying that they were going to be identified, that it was not to embarrass them, but we knew that there had to be some work done in certain districts. I was not a very popular advocate for a few weeks, and was getting some incredibly mean calls. We knew that was going to happen. So we worked with the Department of Education. They didn't know where the data came from. I said it came from the Department of Education. They asked where that came from. I had to tell them it was from you. And so we linked them up with data folks at the Department of Education to explain to them why their numbers were what they were. I didn't get one call back. So clearly there not only do we have to be educated, but it was clear that people in school districts had to
sort of shift the definition.
Right? And the report got, oh my goodness, an awful lot of attention, and really brought the issue to the forefront. Over the next few years, we published 2 more reports. And one in our offices. We're a statewide organization, but our offices are in Newark, and we had one on the early years in Newark because we have state-funded preschool, and in the high schools. And we saw in that time period about 8,000 fewer New Jersey students who were chronically absent, with fewer districts making the list. Nobody wanted to be on the list. At the same time, we thought that legislation was warranted that would define chronic absenteeism, that would make sure that residents actually knew what their district, what their chronic absenteeism numbers were, because it wasn't really being published, and to put some pressure on districts who had high percentages to come up with some plan. For that to happen, we had to educate the legislators. And so what we did, because all politics is local, we rejiggered the numbers, and we sent them their data for every school district in their legislative districts. So they saw it wasn't just the districts in other legislators' communities, but in fact, we have 40 legislative districts in New Jersey. Every one of them had a certain percentage of districts that were chronically absent. We didn't have a hard time finding sponsors for the bill.
Yeah.
And so the bill included that the districts had to publish their chronic absenteeism numbers in their school report cards, and that the districts that were 10% or more had to come up with a corrective action plan that included things like determining the problem, making recommendations, communicating the strategies to their community, and also that parents would be involved in the strategies. What I thought that this was just common sense, But there was a lot of pushback on it. And in fact, it took 2 legislative sessions to actually get the bill signed into law. There were things, the conversations about the definition, they wanted the commissioner to define it, or through the Department of Education. We had this, I never forget it, this huge conversation about excused and unexcused absence. What would a college visit, which would that fall under? Things like that. So this went on for, and a real pushback on having parents involved. In our 2 local chronic absenteeism reports, we saw that the way in which we had to tackle chronic absenteeism had to include that parent lens. And so we really insisted on it, and we finally got it through. It was signed into law in 2018 by our current governor, Governor Phil Murphy.
Great. Something you said sort of leads into what my next question, which was about the sort of pushback this legislation received. A lot of times in people wanting to respond to absenteeism, the response is punitive, like, let's get these kids, let's fine them, let's jail them, let's suspend them for missing school. Did you all, as the legislature went through, receive that kind of pushback? And after you guys answer, then I'd love for Hedy to talk about what we know from research about what punitive approaches do. But Representative Johnson or Gwen or Cynthia, was the push for punitive part of what you were hearing?
In Utah, we ran that, spent a lot of time dealing with this subject. And I think because of the fact that we were trying to get out in front of it, and then with the approach that we were going to take, we really didn't get pushback. So I have to tell you that I think our State Department of Education, the juvenile justice system, did a really good job of informing their folks about what was going on and what we planned to do. So we avoided a lot of that. And my recollection of it during this bill was passed during the 2023 session. It passed out of committee with 100% approval rate, did that in the House and also in the Senate. So there was broad and deep support, bipartisan support for HB 400.
What did you all find in New Mexico or New Jersey? Was there a group that was pushing for the punitive approach?
In the legislature, no, I would say very similar to what Dan is saying in New Mexico. However, what's been fascinating is we're seeing more pushback now, few years after implementation, in terms of, as chronic absenteeism is not going down and schools are still struggling with it, particularly as a result of the pandemic. Now we're getting the pushback in terms of, well, maybe we need to go back to those punitive methods. And that is not necessarily coming from the legislature, although we may see that in a year or so. It's coming from our school districts leaders.
Yeah, our experience was the same. I was trying to remember, but I think in both houses it was unanimous in support of the bill. It was not. It was different education groups. But to take this just one step away from the legislature, when we're in the midst of this work, I remember a principal there was a policy in their school district that had a child couldn't come to school unless they had their uniform on. And she said she started measuring things by asking, what are we in the business of doing? And I think that really, for me, reframed, how do we think about this? If districts went back and said for all of their policies, what are we in the business of doing? She said in this particular case, we're in the business of educating. And so when the district puts up barriers through policy,
right,
then we need to think about it differently. I know in one district, in many districts, if a student had missed too much school, then they were suspended and they couldn't come back until the parent came in, right? Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Is that if we want to fight chronic absenteeism, the policy should not be to keep them out. So I always kind of use that as a touchstone. What are we in the business of doing, and does the policy allow us to do what we're supposed to be doing. And that really, when districts look that way, it's a much clearer way of how do we move forward.
Yeah. And Hedy, you recently did some research with some other folks about excused absences, and even how excused absences, the way they're characterized, can have a punitive
It's actually unexcused absence.
I'm sorry, unexcused.
But yeah, let me just clarify a couple things, and then I'll go into that research. There is a growing body of research that shows the key to reducing chronic absence is finding out why kids miss school and then addressing the issues and barriers that cause it. And there's along with that body of research, it's suggesting that when we just take blanket punitive approaches, putting kids, connecting them to the criminal justice system, finding punitive approaches, they don't actually solve the underlying issues. They can even make it harder to forge the partnerships that you need with kids and families to understand what those underlying barriers are. What I also think we don't recognize so much is that the labeling, the process of a punitive approach begins far earlier than we recognize. It actually begins with the labeling of an absence as excused versus unexcused. This is way before you ever get into the connection to courts and fines or anything. When an absence is labeled unexcused, in many states, teachers do not have to help their child, allow a child to make up for the missed exam, turn in the homework, help them with supporting what was missed. And, you know, Cynthia, you say, well, what are we in the business of doing? If we're in the business of helping kids learn, then just because an absence was labeled unexcused should not be the basis for not allowing a child to learn, right? And in addition, when it's labeled unexcused, I think it could even be influencing how that teacher thinks about a child. Oh, Gwen was unexcused. She must not care about school. And that, you know, and this is a flaunt to my authority almost. Right. As opposed to, and the other thing that I would say is we've been trying to gather information. This is also a little bit in that policy report, but we don't have very good definitions of what's excused versus unexcused. I tell you, it feels like in sometimes it's like up to the mood of the clerk who decided, oh, should I label Phyllis's absence excused versus unexcused? And there are real examples. Let's say you have two kids, kid A and kid B. They're both sick. Kid A has access to a doctor and a doctor's note. Kid B is out 5 days, doesn't have access to a doctor's note, and maybe because they don't have access to healthcare, they might even miss more days without documentation, which then results in their absence being unexcused. But the truth is, both kids were sick. And so, and then if families feel that my child was labeled unexcused, and in fact, unexcused absences then usually often result in some kind of not very kindly worded notice that says, your kid missed school, get them to school. And if they think that that means the school really doesn't understand their circumstances, understand their lives, and doesn't care about their kid, it could further alienate them from the process. And as we're seeing more and more truancy notifications going out because of the increase in absences, I can't tell you how much flack I've heard, even in my state of California, from legislators who were so mad that their kid got a truancy notification, and it makes them distrust the education system more. So having a punitive blaming blanket approach rather than reaching out to families and understanding what's going on is really important. I also think it sometimes feeds this myth that if it's excused, it's okay, when excused absences can also add up to too much time on task. So we're creating these false dichotomies when really what we need to do is use absences to understand when to reach out to families. And the other problem is that when we use the data, and this is because California has been amazing in making data on how many absences are excused versus unexcused. You can disaggregate it by race, by socioeconomics, by disabilities, by whole bunches of things. And you can see which kids more likely have unexcused, have their absences labeled unexcused. And it turns out poverty is a huge factor. Kids who are poor are much more likely to have their absences unexcused. But it's not just poverty. There's also racial differences. So kids who are African American, Native American, Latino, Pacific Islander are much more likely, even when you take into account poverty, to have their absences labeled unexcused. And in one district, they took a look, because in California you can disaggregate it. I asked them about their data. It actually turned out their Latino kids had mostly excused absences. Their African American kids did not. And this is a district that had really taken some thoughtful approaches. And when reflecting on it, the district said, well, you know, we have a lot of staff, we have a lot of outreach in Spanish. We're pretty good at connecting with the Latino families. But what I think they weren't so good is at connecting with their African American families to truly understand what was going on. So this is where data can really have power, and we need this is one thing states can do. You can make it easy to look at those disparities, and then you can create the space, not in a blaming way, but to say, hey, why do these disparities exist? And do they maybe reflect differences in practices that may not be intentional, but that might actually be causing us to drive families away, when the key to improving attendance is partnering, as you said, Cynthia, with families, with young people, to understand the challenges and come up with viable solutions.
Thank you. Anybody want to add? There's so many good questions coming in that I'm going to start in with questions, but if anybody had anything wanted to add to Hedy's point. Oh, Dan.
Yeah, just I think that those are great points, and we really tried to take that approach. And our State Department is building, policy and action plans, and we're working with superintendents across the state to implement it. But I think there's three broad approaches that we're hearing and seeing, and I listened in the education committee meeting that I was in last week. Is that one, and I think this fits with what we were just hearing, is you have to take a comprehensive approach, not just singular about how you're going to solve this problem. Yeah, the second thing is that you need to be positive rather than negative, no matter what you're doing. And just get people in their mindset around helping individuals, reaching out to individuals and engaging them. I think that's going to be an important answer. We can teach people about that. We can teach ways to do that. And then the third thing is do this over time. This is not going to get fixed, during the first month of school. It's going to be several months, maybe several years in lots of places. But unless we use the data and have really, really strong data, and then make our action plans based on that strong data, I think we're going to really see a big change. So one of the things our state has done is to look at the relationship, for example, between 2018 and the students' overall performance in all these disaggregated areas, and what their achievement was during 2021, when we had the high chronic absenteeism and absenteeism in general. In every category, in comparing 2018 and in 21-22, the achievement went down.
Yeah.
We know we have that direct relationship. And so it matters that we collectively work on this.
Yeah. One of the questions that I had, and somebody else from the audience is asking, is what are states doing differently as we see these increases since COVID and the difficulty in re-engaging students and families? And the question I was thinking about, do we need to change the way we do attendance, the way we do school? Are there ways that the pandemic has fundamentally changed our approach to attendance? Gwen?
Yeah, sure. I definitely think that is the case at secondary for sure. In secondary school, high school and middle school needs some significant innovation, I believe. One of the reasons that I think we are seeing these trends in terms of continued, if not increasing, chronic absenteeism is the pandemic exacerbated isolation for these students. It exacerbated their exposure to trauma, a whole host of things, and we see trends in terms of fear to return to school, but it also probably exacerbated addiction to the internet, whether it was gaming or social media or types of engagement in the virtual world. And when that happens, and it's a very real thing, I think, in terms of what we're facing for some students, our school, our teachers and classrooms are competing with something that's giving a very interesting feedback loop for students that becomes addictive. The virtual space is incredibly, it's designed to engage our brains, all brains, but particularly our youth are susceptible to that in the adolescent brain in terms of how they engage in that space. So I feel like there's a certain impact. And I think that what Hedy said in terms of the punitive nature and how we relate to our youth right now is even more impactful given this particular potential impact on our students. I think that there was also a mention in terms of teachers, and I think that's a very real relationship in terms of teachers being treated as a profession, or educators feeling like they are a profession and they're valued and they're paid substantially, because at the very heart of all of this is the relationship between the teacher and the student.
Mm-hmm.
Teachers don't feel valued. There's going to be a direct impact on students, and that's going to impact attendance, and it's going to impact in terms of how they feel coming to school. So the system is entirely related.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Phyllis, I wanted to offer up a couple thoughts. One is that one impact of the pandemic is that I actually think we have to find some ways to change our messaging about why attendance matters. We have heard from folks talking to families, is families actually don't get why showing up in person matters as much anymore. They're like, oh, my kids can make up for it. I can miss, and if I have a family trip, oh, I'm just going to go on we hear that a lot about, and I think some of it is that there's a misperception of how much you can make up a little bit, like virtual learning isn't as much an option.
Right.
There's some complicated things in here, but one of the things that we had to shift in our work was to not just do if you miss 2 days, then you're off track. Also, because if families missed a lot of days, that can almost feel overwhelming if you've missed a ton of days. So we actually shifted our messaging to saying showing up matters for real, because it gives you this opportunity to build routines, which are so essential to recover from chaos and to get your social emotional well-being in place. It's about engagement, because when you show up, you build those relationships, as you talked about, Gwen, to peers and to teachers. And relationships, we have to almost intentionally build those relationships. It's about access to resources, whether that's healthcare, expanded learning, and then it is also about learning. But we have to give people more concrete handles for why showing up every day in school matters. At the same time, I will say, while I totally agree with you, Gwen, about virtual learning, we also have noticed that we need to focus on still actually expanding access to internet and connectivity, because we have to incentivize when kids miss too much school. Where are those opportunities for them to make up for the lost learning time? How do you And I think there may be good and bad uses of virtual spaces, and we got to figure out more of the good uses of virtual space and incentivize so that there are ways that folks can use tutoring, expanded learning, other things. So if kids miss, what's in the way to make sure they can come back to it? And then the last thing I would just say is, I think all of this, and this is something you, Dan, mentioned about a comprehensive approach. I think part of the reason we've seen sort of a surge in, oh, let's go to this legal punitive approach, it's people like throwing up their hands. Oh my God, this is beyond my control. As a teacher, I can't do too much. And so, well, an easy thing would be to refer them to court. And I almost feel like, you know, because that feels like it might be a solution, people are going to it. And the issue is we got to give them other alternatives. We need to have resource, so community partners. So when you have a challenge, a kid struggling with chronic absence, you can refer them to someone who can then have the time to do a home visit and figure out what's going on. If that's something that the teacher can't do because they may be too tired, do not have enough resources. And, you know, and I think that's where, you know, Phyllis, you and I have looked a lot at the work of Connecticut, which used its data to identify early on, here are places and here are districts and here are grades that need more people to be able to have the power to go out and do home visits and do a relationship building over time. And by engaging in those LEAP home visits, they were able to improve attendance by 15 percentage points. But that's because they didn't just say, oh, teachers, just go ahead and add it. They added resources to and use the community and used other resources to expand capacity. And the challenge we have with COVID relief dollars going away is both we need to think about expanding those resources to do that in-depth work, and we're going to have to figure out how to sustain it, because the chronic absence challenge is going to last longer than our COVID relief dollars are currently available.
Well, and I want to come back to that, but I first want to come back to the point that you and Gwen were making about online learning, because I know Dan is heading up a task force in Utah looking at the role of online learning, and how that interplays with attendance. What are you all talking about?
Well, that's really interesting, because attendance during 2022 for us was an interim study that I ran. And you can see, or hear, at least I hope, that we had some really, really good outcomes from that. But we also discover something that was just mentioned, and that is that what is the alternative for kids that, you know, maybe they want to stay home and they want to do online learning with their family. Maybe they're going to be a homeschool child. Maybe a kid wants to have credit recovery. Maybe there's students that are new Americans, immigrants to our country, who need access to different language things and stuff like that. So we are looking. I've run a lot of bills around those areas as well. But specifically, we are taking a look at the infrastructure across the state of Utah in terms of accessibility in school district by school district and home by home who has access to the internet. And if a kid wants, and then how do you share that information either across districts or between universities? If a kid lives in a geographical area where there's a university and they want to take a concurrent enrollment course, but the course they really want to take is offered in another community with a different university, but the back end of it, the infrastructure, won't allow the kid to have access. So it's a multitude of issues. So here's what we see: this burgeoning of ideas about online schools and online classes, and people wanting access to them. But for us, the back end of it in the infrastructure is not staying up with it. So this is a very complex issue with a lot of moving parts. But I think it's another one of those options that was just mentioned for a child that's home ill and has had some problems, being able to stay up and go through an online program, I think is going to be really helpful to them. So
Yeah.
you're going to see quite a bit of legislation and different sort of fixes just with online education for our state. And I think it's going to have an impact on student achievement when they're not actually in the seat at school.
That's a good point. And I'm now going to go back to Hedy's point about community partners, because they're obviously a key element to this work. But since we're sort of in a state policy focus, what can states do to either let communities know about the partners or enable better collaboration with local partners? Cynthia, or well, let's go with Cynthia and then Gwen.
For Cynthia.
Sure. So, I think two things. One is accountability and financial support. We when we were in the middle of advocating for the legislation, I remember a district superintendent saying, a plan doesn't mean is just writing on paper. How, if it's not implemented. And so oversight and is critically important. So that's certainly part. But we've talked a lot about different approaches, creative approaches, and none of them are free. And it is important that states understand that the only way, whether it's online or whether it's in school, which I would just like to say that relationships, particularly with high school students, matter. And that in our work, we saw that kids came to school when they had at least one adult strong relationship within the school. So Dan, I completely agree with you. There are times when online education is important. It may be the only avenue, but we can underestimate the importance of the adult relationship with students. But all these things cost money. We're asking, think about what we talked about, the punitive approach, talking about how many districts still say, well, our attendance rates are terrific. We're asking educational professionals to think differently, and to do that, it will cost money. And so when we're looking at Department of Education budgets, they have to include supports for professional development for chronic absenteeism, because it's a very different way of thinking, and that doesn't happen organically.
And Gwen,
I would agree wholeheartly with everything that Cynthia said. A couple of ways that I think we've been funding it in New Mexico, some examples. There was a really good question in the Q&A earlier in terms of how do you fund this without sort of incentivizing in a negative way chronic absenteeism. So things that are really important in this space are recognizing how you build out and then fund appropriate counselor to student ratio, how you fund attendance supports within your schools, the actual adults in those schools, and how that might be funding through your funding formula. Out of school time networks, how are you incentivizing and or funding out of school time networks to support your schools? Because a lot of times, one thing we haven't talked about is in terms of attendance, parents also need support outside, or guardians need support outside of the school day, and that it actually impacts attendance. So how you fund school time networks and partner community schools in terms of, there was also a great comment in terms of washing machines, all of the supports that go around to build in infrastructure for schools and students and families and communities. And then last but not least, extended learning time, really a key component in terms of also adding to this support for students in school.
Great. Someone had a really good question. What can states do to keep districts and schools motivated and focused on taking a comprehensive approach to improving attendance and engagement, since it's clearly going to be a years-long work? Dan, you want to get started there, and then Hedy?
Sure. Just really quickly, I think the thing that we need to do is make sure that people have the data that they need to make good decisions at the local level. And I think what has been said about the use of data and informing people so that, we don't make them feel bad about what's going on, but we just see the reality of it. And, we continue to have those discussions about the relationship between absenteeism, chronic absenteeism, and how a child performs in school. And then, just continuing to understand that this idea of engaging people back in school is got to be central to the conversation. So, one of the things that we passed HB 411 in this past session, and it allows for schools to be able to use mental health money that's been given to them to hire individuals to work with students, like behavior support personnel at a school site. So, doing things like that, I think, are going to make a big difference in states. So,
Yeah.
Agree wholeheartedly with that funding thing, but there's many ways to do it. And it's not a singular approach. It's going to take, a broad approach, understanding all the buckets, or all the balloons that are in the air, and keep them all floating. And I think that's hard, but it's not impossible.
Hedy, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, two things. One, want to reemphasize that part of the motivation is what Gwen talked about, which is building in incentives to address chronic absence through existing initiatives. If you make sure that you're using chronic absence to target who gets expanded learning, and also improvements and reductions, then to somehow recognize and give maybe more resources for expansion of a particular, whether that's expanded learning, health services, providing pre-K, because if you go to pre-K, I mean, the beauty and the challenge of chronic absence is lots of different things can actually affect chronic absence. You don't always want to create a separate chronic absence initiative, because that makes people not recognize the integration. On the other hand, I also think you can take a strategy from the New Jersey playbook, which was they went and found great localities that had made a difference. They looked for bright spots, they showed districts, and then you highlight that. And in every state, you can always find the positive outliers, if you will, who show, and usually they're taking that integrated approach. And then also learning from those positive outliers, where are the state policies that made it harder for them to do what they were doing? And what are the state policies that would actually make it easier for other folks to replicate their effective practices? And then just using the power of persuasion and inspiring story to help other folks feel hope that change is possible.
Cynthia?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, whether you're talking about the state or the local level, intentionality is everything. This has to be a priority of the state. And I'm not besmirching our Department of Education. I'm just saying that it has to be a priority, even though there's so many other things going on, because it's directly linked to student success. And so, and intentionality at the district level. This is an all hands on deck type of work. It's not, it's not attendance officers alone. Everybody has to be involved. And that's the next thing, is leadership. Whether it's at the Department of Education level, the governor's level, or whether it's the district superintendent or the building principal, leadership, making sure that this is a priority, and that being voiced by the leader of whatever entity, educational entity we're talking about, is key, because as you get buy-in and it knows it's just not, and that's how you have systems change, rather than students in just a lucky classroom, lucky students in a particular classroom.
Right. Gwen, did you want to add something?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that we don't have a student on our panel, but going to student voice is really critical in this space. I think students can tell us a lot about what we need to do to improve our classroom instruction, what we need to do to improve our system, to address access, what supports they might need. And talking to families, we've heard that again. I think we've heard that from Cynthia really eloquently, and Dan, Hedy. But the students themselves are really important in this space in terms of how we might address attendance.
Yeah, that's really great. Well, that takes us right to our time. It's 2:59. Thank you all for joining. This has been such a good conversation, and I've learned so much about what's going on in the states and what states can do to make a difference. We will be getting the tape recording of this either this afternoon or tomorrow and sending an email to everybody who registered, along with any of the resources that people talked about today. There were a lot of really good questions we didn't get to. We'll see if we can save them and get answers, but stay tuned. And Attendance Works has a great website that's all about attendance, so chances are you've got an answer there if you didn't get it here. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Phyllis.
Thanks so much, Phyllis.
Thanks. I guess we just sign out. Yeah. All right. Thanks. Bye.